So in this estate tax planning conversation, valuations are very important, and just getting your arms around how much money are we really looking at. And that may mean even just projecting out, okay, here's how much the potential estate tax liability would be. Here's what you're looking at. And here are the options we can employ, the tools we can use to fix that. So this is not an all or nothing type of planning. It's really just looking at numbers and we're math people in in my job. So we're looking at numbers and saying, okay, what are you willing to give up to, help mitigate this estate tax issue?
For people planning, some of the tools. So when we say like what you can do, so for an estate plan, we know we need to have powers of attorney, trust, will, pieces like this. I guess, can you give us kind of like a high level of ways that people are planning, or what you're kind of seeing?
Right. I kind of alluded a minute or two ago to the idea of gifting. We sort of generally refer to it as gifting. And where we often see that is really kind of pushing assets downstream to descendants. That's a very common strategy. And it doesn't have to be descendants, it can be, anyone that you wish to benefit. And frequently, an issue that comes up with that question, with that type of gifting or planning, is, as I mentioned before, dominion and control. People really struggle with, I have to give up control of this asset. And I guess I should say, another piece of the puzzle is that possibly the descendants that you are hoping to benefit, they may not be anywhere near an age or an experience level where they are prepared to deal with a large chunk of money. So that's a very common sort of big picture plan. And one of the ways we implement is by, yes, setting up trusts. We can set up, for example, just irrevocable trusts for each of the descendants. And then we can even add in an intervening level of potentially an LLC or another type of entity. And part of the structure of that is to um, help the grantor, the person making the gift, to at least have some sort of oversight of the asset. It's not just, here, I'm going to give you this stack of cash and you do with it what you please. That's often a very big, the balancing act, like I said before, of giving up enough dominion and control to satisfy the IRS that, okay, you gave this away, it's no longer in your estate, but you can still have some influence over it. So that's that's a pretty common structure. That's kind of like LLC plus trusts. We have lots of other trust vehicles, SLATs and GRATs. Sorry, we're lawyers and we love acronyms.
Mhm.
And those types of asset management, those types of they're gifting, but it's also this idea. You and I were talking about this earlier, of making a gift of something, of an asset at its present value, with the understanding that most likely it's going to appreciate. And so, with any of those types of trust, the idea is you get it out of your estate at the dollar cost now in today's dollars, but then by the time you pass away, it's probably worth far more. And so you've gotten that appreciation out of your estate, but with certain types of trusts, you can still maintain access. You can still live in the home, for example. You can, continue to really sort of possess the asset while still satisfying the IRS that you don't own it anymore. So like I said, so many of these things are just, there's no one size fits all. It's very tailored and very specific, and can be graduated. We can start slow, and it's just that balancing of burden versus benefit. I mean, I have some clients who are so driven by keeping that estate tax, out of the equation, that because in their mind, it's, the balancing is, I'm willing to give up some control because that means this money doesn't end up with the IRS or, the Illinois Department of Revenue, for example.
I think that's helpful. So it probably even somewhat depends on the types of assets that people own. So if we're talking someone who owns a lot of real estate versus someone that just has a lot of taxable funds that are in investments that are maybe more liquid, I'm sure that kind of even plays into it too, and the use of those assets and what they're going to be needed for in the future. So I could even see that being something that plays into that.
For sure. And I'm sure you see this as well. There are so many other complications, with retirement accounts, for example. Many of my clients have really developed a large portion of their net worth by being savvy retirement investors. And some 2020 changes in the law have made that a little tricky. Maybe we can do another podcast about that.
Exactly. Yep.
But, so it really is very client and asset specific. You're spot on, right?
Yeah. And I like the idea that you mentioned too, that so estate planning, when we're talking about planning and getting assets out of your estate to, essentially give today. So that is growing out of your estate. Now you're not paying that estate tax on it federally or with the state you live in. Some people, yeah, say, I don't want to pay any tax because I want all of these assets to go to the beneficiary. So I want all of this to be passed on. Some people might say, I'm okay if I have to pay estate tax. I just want to be the one to pay it. And then the remainder of the assets go to the beneficiaries. But I think this is even really helpful for people to even see what amounts are we talking about? Because if we start talking about, well, my estate tax is going to be, $500,000 or $1 million, those get to be big dollars where it can become really important to say, I would much rather that go to a charitable organization or to my kids and grandkids rather than that. And so I think even just helping people to see, like, here's the dollar amount that we're talking about. So now that helps people to decide. But yeah, you have people in a couple different camps even on that thought.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So a client who really has the basic estate planning documents, hasn't done anything, I guess, leading up to that time wise, what's your encouragement to them to say, hey, let's be sure that you're starting because this is going to take you, X number of months, or how long do you feel like on average is kind of this process? And I'm sure it depends on the size of the estate as well, but walk somebody through who's kind of just starting the thinking in this process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to feel comfortable, I would want at least a year, just because there are so many moving pieces to it. If you have to add valuations in, you need to hire a company to do an appraisal. All those types of things can make things take longer. And it's certainly not, I'll tell you, it's not at all uncommon for us, and probably many tax advisors out there, probably you as well. That December 31 deadline is sometimes it's midnight, but in an ideal world, if you can start looking at these things now and develop a comprehensive game plan that's not guessing, that
Yeah.
has, real good data behind it,
Hmm.
now is a great time to really think about it. And one other piece of the puzzle is to zoom out a bit on this planning idea is there's not much of a downside from the standpoint of, if you do this planning, let's say that you say, okay, I am going to gift, X amount of dollars down to the next generation because right now my exemption is at an historic high. I'm going to use it. And then Congress acts and they drop the exemption down, and you've gifted away more than the exemption. You've won. I mean, you've pushed a substantial amount of assets out of your own estate and onto, charities or the next generation, however you choose to do it. And if the IRS lowers the exemption, like I said, you've won. But the flip side of that is, if the exemption stays the same, or even if it goes up, you haven't lost, because you've already pushed those assets out of your estate for tax purposes. And really, the big issue about those things, from a less about the exemption perspective, and this is absolutely your wheelhouse and not mine, but those assets that you've given to the next generation, or however you've structured them, are, if you do it right, going to continue to grow. So by making those gifts at today's dollar value, even setting aside the issue of the estate tax exemption, if you run that analysis and you say, okay, 20 years from now, those assets are going to be worth, pick a metric, 10 times what they were. That's a win.